The night was thick with tension, the air heavy with the scent of gunpowder and the distant hum of city lights. The alley was dark, a perfect cover for the kind of business Jungkook and YN were trained to handle. "Don't slow me down, princess," Jungkook muttered, his voice as sharp as the blade tucked in his jacket. YN clenched her jaw. "Don't get in my way, Jian." They were a team, forced to be, but that didn't mean they liked it. YN was the daughter of Mr. Lee, the most feared mafia king in the city, and Jungkook. He was the son of Mr. Jian, her father's closest ally. Their bloodlines were tied to power, yet their hatred for each other ran just as deep. Tonight's mission was simple: catch the traitor, a man who had double-crossed Jungkook's father in a $1 million deal, selling secrets to their enemies. The price of betrayal in the mafia world was always paid in blood. The target bolted through the alley. YN's heels clicked against the pavement as she sprinted after him, her gun aimed steady. She was fast, faster than most, but so was Jungkook. "Stop!" YN growled, her voice echoing through the empty street. The traitor didn't listen. He turned a sharp corner, but YN was right behind him. She could taste victory. Just a few more steps and she'd grab him by the collar and drag him back to face his punishment. But before she could reach him, a strong arm shot out from behind her. Jungkook. He was faster, stronger, always a step ahead. With one swift move, Jungkook tackled the man to the ground, pinning him with a knee to his back. The traitor thrashed, cursing. But Jungkook pressed a gun to his head. "Game over," Jungkook hissed, his voice deadly calm. He stood there, breathless, not from the chase, but from the bitter sting of losing. Again. "You stole my catch," she snapped, her fists clenching at her sides. Jungkook smirked, his dark eyes glimmering under the streetlights. "I saved you from failing. You're welcome." In's blood boiled. "I didn't need saving, Jian." "You always do." Silence, their eyes locked, fire against fire. It was always like this between them, a war neither of them could win. But then something shifted. The man beneath Jungkook spat blood onto the ground and smirked. "You think you've won, little prince," he sneered. "Your father. He's next." Jungkook's jaw tightened. His finger twitched against the trigger, but YN placed a hand on his wrist, stopping him. "Not yet," she whispered. "We need him alive." For a moment, their fingers brushed, a brief, unspoken truce before Jungkook yanked his hand away, his usual cold mask slipping back into place. But YN saw it. That flicker of something? Concern? Care? No, it couldn't be. Not from him. Not from her enemy. The traitor's laugh echoed through the alley, a sinister sound that made YN's skin crawl. Jungkook's jaw was tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the man's collar. His fingers still hovered dangerously close to the trigger, but YN's hand remained on his wrist, firm but steady. "Don't," she whispered, her voice a low warning. "He's worth more alive." Jungkook didn't move. His dark eyes were locked onto the traitor's smirk like a wolf ready to tear apart its prey. The tension between them was suffocating, and for once, it wasn't just the usual war between YN and Jungkook. This was bloodlust. "Jian," YN's voice sharpened. "I said, not yet." Finally, Jungkook's grip loosened, just enough for the man to cough and gasp for air. Without another word, he yanked a pair of handcuffs from his belt and cuffed the traitor's hands behind his back. "Let's get him to the warehouse," Jungkook muttered, his voice a shade colder than before. YN didn't reply, but her heart was still racing, and it wasn't just from the chase. She had seen it, the rage, the fury burning behind Jungkook's usually blank expression. He wasn't just here for a mission. This was personal. The warehouse. The room was dimly lit. The only sound was the faint dripping of water somewhere in the distance. The traitor was tied to a chair, blood trickling from his temple. But his grin never faltered. YN leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching as Jungkook paced in front of the man like a caged predator. "You sold my father's intel to the Black Crows," Jungkook said softly, his calmness far more dangerous than if he had shouted. "You think that comes without a price?" The man chuckled, A mistake. In a flash, Jungkook grabbed the back of the chair and yanked it forward, forcing the traitor's face mere inches from his own. YN flinched not from fear, but from something else entirely. She had seen Jungkook like this before, ruthless, untouchable, but tonight, there was something darker gnawing at him. Who paid you off? Jungkook growled. Who gave the order? Silence. In's patience snapped. She stepped forward, her voice like ice. Answer him, unless you want me to take over. The traitor's eyes flickered to her, and for the first time, fear crept into his expression. Jungkook smirked. You should listen to her. She may look like a princess. His gaze slid to YN, lingering for just a second too long. But she's more ruthless than you think. In's heart did that annoying thing again, the slight skip. But she pushed it down, hard. He's just playing a game. Don't fall for it. The traitor's swollen lips curled into a disgusting grin. His blooded teeth flashed beneath the dim light as his gaze dropped, not at YN's face, but lower. Then show me, he rasped, his voice a sickening mix of mockery and lust. Show me how ruthless you can be, sweetheart. Silence. A dangerous, bone-chilling silence. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. YN's fists tightened at her sides, her blood boiling. But before she could say a word, the sound of flesh meeting flesh echoed through the warehouse. Jungkook's fist connected with the man's jaw so hard that the chair tipped backward, crashing to the ground. The traitor let out a strangled scream, but it was cut short as Jungkook grabbed him by the collar and yanked him back upright, the chair legs scraping violently against the concrete. Don't ever look at her like that. Jungkook's voice was low to calm, but his eyes burned with pure rage. The man coughed, spitting blood onto the floor, but before he could speak again, another punch, then another, and another. It wasn't controlled. It wasn't calculated. It was fury, unfiltered, uncontrollable fury. Jungkook, YN stepped forward, grabbing his arm, but he didn't stop. The man's face was unrecognizable now, blood pouring from his nose, his lips split wide open. But Jungkook wasn't finished. Without a word, Jungkook pulled a knife from his belt, the blade gleaming under the faint light. The traitor's remaining eye widened in fear. Please. Jungkook's voice was a whisper, but it cut sharper than the blade itself. You looked at her with these eyes, he murmured, his fingers ghosting over the man's bloodshot eyes. Let me fix that. And then, the knife plunged into the man's right eye. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the warehouse. YN's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen as she watched Jungkook twist the blade, slow, cruel, deliberate, until the eye was nothing but a mangled mess of blood and tissue. The man thrashed, but Jungkook grabbed his jaw, forcing him to stay still. One down, Jungkook whispered, his voice eerily soft. Now, let's deal with the tongue you used to talk about her. The traitor sobbed broken, wet sound, but Jungkook didn't hesitate. He forced the man's mouth open, his knife hovering over his tongue. Jungkook, YN's voice cracked, a mix of shock and something else, something she couldn't name, but Jungkook didn't even glance her way. With a swift motion, the blade sliced through the traitor's tongue. Blood poured from the man's mouth, his muffled screams filling the air. But Jungkook didn't blink. He wiped the blade on the man's shirt, his face devoid of any emotion. Then, as if it was nothing, he leaned in close to the barely conscious man and whispered, You won't look at her again. You won't speak about her again. His lips curled into a cruel smile. Because you no longer have the eyes to see her, or the tongue to insult her. Silence. The man slumped in the chair, a broken shell of what he once was. Jungkook finally stepped back, his chest heaving, but his face remained calm, eerily so, and stared at him, at the blood on his hands, the darkness in his gaze, and for the first time. She didn't know if she was more afraid of him or of the way her heart still managed to race, because this wasn't just revenge. It was possessiveness. The traitor was barely conscious, a gory mess of blood and broken bones. His body slumped in the chair, head hanging at an unnatural angle. Jungkook's knuckles dripped crimson, but his face was void of emotion. as if what he just did was as casual as lighting a cigarette. And then, without a word, he grabbed the knife again. One clean slice to the throat. The man gurgled, a sickening sound, before going still, blood pooling beneath the chair. Silence. YN didn't flinch, she didn't speak. She just let out a soft breath, stepping back as Jungkook calmly wiped the blade on the man's shirt. "Mess with you once," Jungkook muttered, kicking the lifeless body over. And he loses his tongue. He glanced at YN, his gaze dark, his jaw still tight, but there was something possessive burning behind his eyes. "Mess with you twice," he added coldly, and he loses his life. YN didn't respond. She had seen this side of Jungkook before, more times than she could count, but it never failed to stir something deep within her. Not fear, something else. Without another word, they left the warehouse, the faint scent of blood lingering behind them. At Mr. Lee's mansion, the air in the grand dining hall was heavy, tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Mr. Lee sat at the head of the table, a cigar resting between his fingers, smoke curling around his stern expression. Jungkook stood before him, his shirt still speckled with blood, though he didn't seem to care. YN leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her face impassive as if this was just another routine night. Finally, Mr. Lee broke the silence. "Who killed him?" His voice was calm, but his dark gaze burned into Jungkook. Jungkook didn't blink. "I did." A muscle in Mr. Lee's jaw twitched. The mission was to catch him alive. In's eyes flickered to Jungkook, but he didn't hesitate. He tried to harass YN. Jungkook replied, voice even, unbothered, but his words carried a dangerous undertone. Silence again. For a moment, Mr. Lee didn't move. His expression didn't change. And then, his eyes darkened, a slow, menacing smirk spread across his face. "Good job," Mr. Lee said, his voice like gravel. "Should have cut him into pieces." Jungkook chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Damn," he muttered, shaking his head with a sly grin. "I would've. But now I have to drag him out of the alligator's belly." The room fell quiet before Mr. Lee let out a booming laugh. "Next time," Mr. Lee said, wiping a tear from his eye, "feed him to the piranhas instead. Easier cleanup." Jungkook smirked, noted. In rolled her eyes, pushing off the wall. "You two are insane," she muttered, turning on her heel and heading for the stairs. "Good night to you too, princess," Jungkook called after her, his voice laced with that same teasing drawl that made YN's blood boil. She didn't bother replying. Mr. Lee's laughter echoed down the hallway as YN shut her bedroom door. Jungkook let out a soft breath, running a hand through his hair. The taste of violence still lingered in his mouth, but so did the thrill of protecting YN, even if she'd never thank him for it. "Get some rest," Mr. Lee said, leaning back in his chair. "We've got bigger threats coming." Jungkook's smirk faded. Bigger threats. But in his mind, there was no threat greater than anyone who dared to lay a hand or even a dirty look on YN. Without another word, Jungkook left the mansion, the night swallowing him whole. And yet, his mind stayed with YN. It always did. The next morning came too quickly. The sun was a little too bright, the air too crisp, a cruel contrast to the blood-soaked night YN and Jungkook had left behind. But this was their life, violence in the dark, normalcy in the daylight. YN adjusted her bag on her shoulder as she walked into the bustling college campus. Students laughed, books were exchanged, and the world seemed blissfully unaware of the monsters that roamed beneath the surface. Beside her, In had her best friend kept up a steady stream of chatter, completely oblivious to the storm YN carried behind her calm facade. "So after class," In said, brushing her long hair back, "we can hit the new mall downtown. I heard there's a sale, like the good kind, designer stuff for half off." In gave a small smile, though her mind still echoed with the memory of Jungkook's voice from last night, his cold rage, the way his knife had. "YN," Inha nudged her gently, "are you even listening?" Yeah, shopping, sale, got it," YN replied, shaking the thought away. The college cafeteria buzzed with life, clinking trays, laughing students, the faint sound of music playing from someone's phone. It was the complete opposite of the blood-stained warehouse from the night before. But YN had learned how to live in both worlds. She grabbed her lunch and sat with Inha at their usual table near the window, chatting idly about classes, exams, and the never-ending stress of their final year. On the other side of the cafeteria, however, Jungkook sat with his own crowd, a group of guys just as intimidating as him. Black leather jackets, cold stares, a sharpness to their presence that didn't belong in a place like this. They weren't just students, they were wolves in sheep's clothing. Jungkook leaned back in his chair, one arm slung over the backrest, fingers lazily tapping against his thigh. A half-eaten sandwich lay in front of him, untouched. His jaw was tight, his mind somewhere far from the meaningless conversation his friends were having. Because across the room, YN was laughing. His eyes hadn't left her since she walked in. She was smiling at something Inha said, her hair falling into her face, her hand resting against her cheek as she laughed softly. And it made Jungkook's blood simmer. She looked so normal. Like she hadn't watched him kill a man less than 12 hours ago. Like she wasn't a mafia princess trained to be just as ruthless as him. His fingers curled into a fist. It wasn't jealousy. No, not quite. It was something darker. He hated seeing her act like this, carefree, untouchable. Like she wasn't his to protect. Bro, his friend, Taeyang, nudged him. You've been staring at YN for the past 5 minutes. Jungkook's jaw ticked. I wasn't staring. Hymin said, yeah, then what were you doing analyzing her lunch? Laughter rippled through the group, but Jungkook's glare shut them up instantly. His gaze flicked back to YN, and then, to his irritation, Inha leaned closer to YN, showing her something on her phone, and YN's face lit up. We should get matching outfits, Inha said, grinning. What do you think? Jungkook's teeth clenched. Shopping. She was planning to go shopping after college. Without him knowing, his grip on the table tightened. He didn't like this. Didn't like not knowing where YN was going or with whom. Jungkook, Taeyang said again, smirking. If you're so interested, why don't you just sit with her? Jungkook's head snapped back to his friend. Shut the hell up. But his knee bounced under the table, a telltale sign of his barely contained frustration. Because YN was there, and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, he couldn't sit still when she was there. Not when she was too close to everyone else, and too far from him. After college, the mall buzzed with life, a stark contrast to the cold, quiet nights Jungkook was used to. Bright lights, the smell of fresh pretzels and perfume, and the hum of soft pop music in the background. YN and Inha strolled through the crowd, chatting as they moved from store to store. This one's cute, Inha said, holding up a sleek black dress. It's classy but still dangerous. YN smirked. Inha laughed. Exactly. But YN's mind wasn't fully on the shopping. Not when she could still feel the weight of last night. The blood, the violence, the way Jungkook didn't hesitate to kill that man for simply looking at her the wrong way. It was normal for them. But what wasn't normal was the way Jungkook lingered in her thoughts, his cold anger, his quiet fury. Earth to YN, Inha teased. You keep spacing out, thinking about someone. YN blinked. What? No. Oh really? Inha wiggled her eyebrows, not thinking about a certain mafia prince. Absolutely not. Inha only grinned wider. Sure. But before YN could snap back, a familiar voice cut through the noise. Well, look who it is. Her stomach dropped. Jungkook, standing right there in the same store with a couple of his friends, including Tae and Hymin. Black leather jacket, white shirt, ripped jeans. And that smirk, the one that screamed I'm everywhere, whether you like it or not. In's jaw clenched. What are you doing here? Jungkook's eyes slowly dragged over her, from her outfit to the bags in her hand, before locking onto her gaze with a dangerous gleam. Shopping, he said simply, just like you. Her blood boiled. This mall is huge, and yet you're in the exact same store. Taeyang snorted, leaning against a clothes rack. What can we say? Coincidence. Flashback. Flashback earlier that day. Why the hell do you care what she's doing after college? Taehyung asked, leaning back in his chair. Jungkook's jaw clenched. I don't. Then why are we going to the mall? Jungkook shot him a glare. Because I need new clothes. Tae and Hymin smirked. And it just happens to be the same mall YN's going to. Silence. Jungkook didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a thick wad of cash, slamming it onto the table. Today, he said, his voice low and firm, you're buying whatever the hell they pick. Hymin blinked. Wait, what? Jungkook's eyes darkened. Whatever YN and Inha touch, you buy it. I don't care how much it costs. Hymin let out a slow whistle. Damn, possessive much. Jungkook ignored him, his mind already set. Because no matter what YN thought, no one would be spoiling her today. No one but him. Back to the present, mall. In's eyes narrowed. Seriously, why are you here? Jungkook simply grinned. Told you, just shopping. Before YN could argue, Taehyung grabbed the black dress from Inga's hand. Nice choice, he said casually, walking toward the cashier. We're buying it. What? Inha blinked. No, you're not. Jungkook slid his hands into his pockets, his smirk never faltering. Too late. In's nostrils flared. I didn't ask you to buy anything. Jungkook leaned in, just close enough that only she could hear. You don't have to ask, princess, he whispered. I take care of what's mine. Her heart thundered in her chest, not from fear, but from something far more dangerous. Possessiveness. Control. Jungkook wasn't just coincidentally here. He was here for her. And she hated how much her heart raced at the thought. Jungkook's jaw was tight, his knuckles still white from how hard he'd been clenching his fists. His mind was a storm, a dangerous one. What am I doing? Why did I follow her here? Why do I care what dress she picks or who she's with? His own thoughts felt like knives digging into his skull. I hate her, Jungkook muttered under his breath. His voice was rough, dark, more to himself than anyone else. I hate her. I hate you, YN. His eyes flicked to her standing by her car, laughing softly at something Inha said, carefree and bothered. She messes with my head. I hate you, he repeated, but it sounded more like a lie this time. Then his gaze shifted. A man, tall, rough-looking, was eyeing YN, not just looking, but staring. The kind of stare that made Jungkook's blood boil. The man's smirk was dirty, his stance cocky. Too cocky for someone who didn't know who the hell he was messing with. Jungkook moved without thinking, his legs already propelling him forward, ready to break every bone in that bastard's body. But before he could swing, a blur of movement, a fist connecting with the man's jaw, the sound of bone cracking. It wasn't Jungkook, it was YN. Touch me with your eyes again, and you won't have them, she hissed, shaking her hand from the impact. Jungkook stood there stunned just for a second. Then the corner of his lips tugged upward, an amused yet dark smile. But before YN stepped into her car, she paused. Her head tilted ever so slightly, and without even looking at him, she whispered just loud enough for Jungkook to hear. Don't kill him. Jungkook's smirk deepened. I can't promise that. She didn't reply, just got into her car and drove off, leaving him standing there, the bastard still groaning on the ground. Jungkook watched her car disappear around the corner, his fingers tapping against his leather jacket. Then he pulled out his phone, his voice deadly calm. Get him, he said simply, his eyes locked onto the man still clutching his broken jaw. I want him tied up by the time I get there. A pause. Don't touch him, Jungkook added. He's mine. He ended the call, swung one leg over his motorcycle, and sped off, the roar of the engine drowning out the man's pathetic whimpers. An hour later, the room was cold, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. The man was tied to a chair, blood already dripping from his mouth, a result of YN's punch. But that was nothing compared to what was coming next. Jungkook stood in front of him, silent, still a knife twirling between his fingers like it was a mere toy.